This is a Morin Academy podcast. You can find a link to our newsletter in the show notes below. Please support us on Patreon at the Morin Academy, and we appreciate your support. I will be coming back to Vogelin for one more session where I conclude, but today I'd like to take a brief break to talk about a website that actually influenced me quite a bit, and that is David Holmgren's Future Scenarios website. And I'm going to talk about it a bit today, show you parts of it, and hope you will go to it. I read Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future a little bit ago. I think I mentioned it on the channel here. And it envisions a scenario in which India gets hit with a major heat wave beyond what human beings can deal with, and thousands of people die, and Robinson imagines what people would do in the wake of that. And this website and Holmgren's scenarios gives me the same sort of feeling. It's a feeling that you're looking into the future, and maybe not the so distant future. David Holmgren is the one of the founders of the permaculture movement, and permaculture is about growing things that will work in your environment and preferably do not need to be reseeded, and adapt well and will provide people with food. And it's also about social practices that are resilient and will last even under circumstances that are not so great. So here we have a website that he put together that deals with different future scenarios, both the most rosy scenarios and the most dire and everything in between. And I want to argue that we are in one of those scenarios. And then I'd like to hear from you in the comments as to what you think we are in. He goes through several scenarios. Now, there's a whole lot to this website, and I would encourage people to just go there, just type in futurescenarios.org, and you can find it for yourself. But within these scenarios, he talks about 4 descent scenarios. So this comes from the idea that there are 4 energy futures, and one of those futures is energy descent. And so I'll just briefly go through the other futures that he thinks are possible. Techno explosion, he says, depends on new, large, and concentrated energy sources that will allow the continual growth in material wealth and human power over environmental constraints, as well as population growth. This scenario is generally associated with space travel to colonize other planets. So clearly, there are some people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who are not only thinking about that, but trying to make it happen. The next scenario is techno-stability. He says that depends on a seamless conversion from material growth based on depleting energy to a steady state in consumption of resources and population, if not economic activity, all based on novel use of renewable energies and technologies that can maintain, if not improve, the quality of services available from the current systems. And I might just stop here and just provide the context that this is all kind of like in the mix of all of this thinking is Holmgren's knowledge, which we all have, that, fossil fuels will reach their peak consumption and then will decline because fossil fuels are not a renewable resource. So there will be some point at which fossil fuels become ever more expensive, and then beyond that just become unavailable. And he is kind of baking in here the assumption that people will use them until they are unavailable. Although he also talks a great deal about, and part of these scenarios are about, do they use them until they're unavailable in a wise way or in a way that is not wise? All right. So anyway, we have techno-stability, which is where they start to use them in a wise way as the change prevails. And then we have energy descent. And he says energy descent involves a reduction of economic activity, complexity, and population in some way as fossil fuels are depleted. The increasing reliance on renewable resources of lower energy density will, over time, change the structure of society to reflect many of the basic design rules, if not details, of pre-industrial societies. This suggests a ruralization of settlement and economy with less consumption of energy and resources and a progressive decline in human populations. So here we have, the most sort of like wild, futuristic option here where we completely escape the limits of the planet. Here we're smart enough to use the available fossil fuel resources we have to transition sort of seamlessly to renewable resources, and we work on sustainability, and we sort of head into this steady state where we're not necessarily growing and consuming more, but neither are we declining. And then we have the probably more likely event here, energy descent, where we keep going until we reach the point where we don't have enough resources and we haven't built in and done enough to transition. And this puts a brake on our growth and our ability to continue to take care of ourselves in the way that we have. And it initiates this decline. And then finally, the last scenario, which they come in increasingly gloomy prospects, is collapse. And he says collapse suggests a failure of the whole range of interlocked systems that maintain and support industrial society as high-quality fossil fuels are depleted and/or climate change radically damages the ecological support systems. This collapse would be fast and more or less continuous without the restabilizations possible in energy descent. It would inevitably involve a major die-off of human population and a loss of the knowledge and infrastructure necessary for industrial civilization, if not more severe scenarios, including human extinction, along with much of the planet's biodiversity. I think of the novel A Canticle for Leibowitz here. So in energy descent, people apparently in these scenarios, which we'll talk more about, would have the ability to survive, albeit there would be a certain amount of population reduction and there would be a definite decline in the quality of life if measured by today's standards to almost pre-industrial, if not pre-industrial living. Here, though, even that doesn't happen. And there is some sort of more catastrophic failure, and climate change radically damages ecological support system, leading to collapse and maybe extinction. So if I haven't already made your day more happy, by all means, keep listening. I'm going to keep going here. Steel yourselves, okay? Have some spine and steel yourselves. We got to get used to talking about these things. All right, so let's just pop over to descent scenarios, because it seems to me that the descent scenario is the one that we would want to know the most about, right? If we were in a sort of planning for or anticipating what could possibly happen, it's the most likely of the two gloomy scenarios, perhaps. And it's the one that we could potentially do something about. Obviously, the rosiest scenario, or the second rosiest one, we can also do something about. But in this one, we are dealing more with what really probably will happen, right? So in this one, I just want to look at what he says about these 4 energy descent and climate scenarios. All right, so here we have the 4 energy descent scenarios. These are within the larger category of descent. And he's looking at 4 descent scenarios, each emerging from a combination of either fast or slow oil decline and either mild or severe climate change over the next 10 to 30 years. And they are labeled brown tech, green tech, earth steward, and lifeboats. And they're summarized here. Brown tech is slow oil decline and fast climate change, which seems more like what we're in if we had to pick one of these. And then green tech is slow oil decline and slow climate change. I guess depending upon your perspective, we could be in that. Earth Steward is fast oil decline, slow climate change, where we would have enough time to figure out how to deal with fast oil decline, I suppose. And then Lifeboats is a combination of fast oil decline and fast climate change. So what I'm going to do next is literally look at each one of them. I'm not going to comment a lot on this. I just really want you to know about this, and hopefully you'll go and you'll look at more of this yourself. All right, so let's look at brown tech. Top-down constriction. He says the brown tech world is one in which the production of oil declines after a peak 2005-2010 at about 2% annum. And obviously we're way past that point, but I would say we are probably in this point, or soon will be. And at some point we definitely will be. Anyway, and the subsequent peak and decline of natural gas is also relatively gentle, but the severity of global warming symptoms is at the extreme end of current mainstream scientific predictions. In this scenario, even aggressive national policies and actions prevail to address both the threats and the opportunities from energy peak and climatic change. The political system could be described as corporatist or fascist, which Mussolini described as a merger of state and corporate power. He says the tendency in existing systems for massive centralization, centralized investment by corporations and governments give priority to getting more energy out of lower grade non-renewable resources like tar sands, coals, and uranium, and biofuels from industrial, agricultural, and forestry. Breakthrough technologies provide the constant promise of a better future, but much of the investment in energy harvesting accelerates global warming, at least in the short term. At the same time, the cost of defending or replacing urban infrastructure threatened by storms and future sea level rise consumes more resources, while droughts and chaotic seasonal changes reduce food production from broad acre and small scale agriculture. Flows of energy from more expensive sources such as tar sands, deep ocean oil, gas to liquids, and coal to liquids slow the decline in fuels from crude oil. This transition requires a huge mobilization of technical and managerial capacity held mostly by global corporations, along with the financial, legal, and military security that only sovereign governments can provide. This resource, nationalism by government, break down free trade, and the faith in international markets that underpins the global economy. There's something missing in that sentence, but I think we get the gist of it. All right. So he goes on, but I don't think I need to read all of this. You can read it for yourself. But I do think that there is a possibility that we are in the brown tech scenario. I'll just read this last part. He says, while the elites continue to be driven by a commitment to super rationalists' beliefs, a sense of hollowness and lack of purpose characterizes the shrinking middle class, while fundamentalist religions and cults play a stronger role in the lives of the working and unemployed classes, partly through genuine reactions to the failures of modern humanism and partly manipulated by the elites to deflect anger and disenchantment. The brown tech scenario could be dominant and even more or less socially stable for many decades until ongoing climatic breakdown and reduced net energy drive a shift to the lifeboats scenario. Top-down constriction summarizes the essence of this scenario in that national power constricts consumption and focuses resources to maintain the nation state in the face of deteriorating climate and reduced energy and food supply. Then he's got a image gallery here. Okay, so I do think that of the scenarios, it sounds to me like, in my estimation, we are in the brown tech scenario. Let's look at green tech. Green tech scenario is the most benign in that adverse climate changes are at the low end of projections. Oil and gas production declines slowly, as in the brown tech future, so the sense of chaos and crisis is more muted without major economic collapse or conflict. This allows resources, he says, to flow to a greater diversity of responses at the global, national, city, community, and personal level. In some already densely populated poor countries, conditions worsen. However, higher commodity prices allow some poorer producer economies to escape their debt cycle, while programs to empower women result in rapid reduction in the birth rate. The gradual reduction in capacity of countries to project power globally due to rising energy costs increases national security and redirection of resources away from defense and resource capture to resource conservation and technological innovation. The consolidation of the global communication systems maintains global outlooks and understandings, if not global economics. So, I mean, I don't think, it doesn't seem as though we're heading there. So this is a more optimistic view from his perspective, with more cooperation, with smart use of our available technology. But there are glimmers of it. I mean, he's got photos here of wind turbines and such. I mean, the tragedy and the irony and maybe the beauty of all this is that all of these scenarios are kind of manifesting themselves to a certain extent on our landscape. But the question is, which one is likely to ultimately prevail? Now, he says, as in the brown tech scenario, electrification is a key element in the energy transition, but the renewable energy sources of wind, biomass, solar, hydro, tidal wave, etc., grow rapidly, developing a more diverse and distributed mix. The relatively benign climate allows a resurgence of our rural and regional economies on the back of sustained and growing prices for all natural commodities, including feedstocks for biofuels. Well, I think this is probably the scenario that is, in the realm of conceivable that Holmgren would prefer. Okay, like this would be pretty good. This would represent a fairly smart reaction to our situation. I doubt that will happen, and I hate to say it, but I don't think any amount of talking about it, reasoning with people, I just don't see it happening, but I hope that it does. And then we go to Earth Steward here. Bottom-up rebuild. He says, in this scenario, the decline in oil production after a peak in total liquids produced before 2010 is at the extreme end of authoritative predictions, about 10%, and is followed by an even faster decline in gas production, plus a simultaneous peak in coal production. The shock to the world's fragile financial systems is overwhelming, resulting in severe economic depression and perhaps some further short, sharp resource wars. This economic collapse and these political stresses, more than the actual shortage of resources, prevents the development of more expensive and large-scale non-renewable resources that characterize the brown tech scenario, or the renewable resources and infrastructure of the green tech. International and national communication networks break down. Electrical grids become non-functional as cost and availability of fuels spare parts reduce production, and lack of paying businesses and customers reduces revenues. International tensions remain, but capacity of stronger countries to use military force is constrained by unreliable energy and parts supplies and the strong evidence that war uses more resources than it captures. Global warming is slowed dramatically and reversed by the collapse of the global consumer economy and the absence of large-scale investment in new energy infrastructure. So this scenario, in my view, doesn't seem to be happening. We do have an increase in the availability of large-scale non-renewable resources. Our In other words, our oil life is being extended by such things as fracking and all sorts of ways in which we can extract at yes, more expensive solutions, but for a longer period of time, we can extract fossil fuels. And there also has been some adjustment over time using renewable energy as well in the mix, just maybe not enough to like create the more optimistic scenario of the green tech. Okay. But one could argue that we could perhaps still get to green tech if there was enough climate change pressure, because we have built up some know-how in that area, right? And some change has taken place. All right. Well, anyway, so you get the idea here. And then we'll look at lifeboats. And this is civilization triage. He says, in this scenario, supplies of high-quality fossil fuels decline rapidly, the economy fails, and human contributions to global warming collapse, but lag effects and positive feedbacks in the climate system continue to drive an acceleration of global warming. He says, as of 2007, an increasing number of scientists believe it may already be too late to avoid catastrophic climate change. In the lifeboat scenario, the adverse symptoms of the brown tech and earth steward scenarios combine to force a progressive collapse in most forms of economy and social organization. Local wars, including use of nuclear weapons, accelerate collapse in some areas, but the failure of national systems of power prevent global warfare. Successive waves of famine and disease break down social and economic capacity on a larger scale than the Black Death in medieval Europe, leading to a halving of global population in a few decades. And believe me, no amount of prepping is going to do anybody any good in that scenario. It's just maybe a certain amount of knowing how to pay attention to what's going on around you might help you more than anything else. He says, new forms of oasis agriculture that are low input versions of the brown tech intensive systems evolve that stabilize food production as chaotic seasons make traditional field agriculture and horticulture almost impossible. Forest and rangeland hunting and harvesting become the predominant use of resources over large regions, supporting nomadic bands. Warrior and gang cults provide meaning in a world of grief and violence, leading to the development of new religions and even languages that attempt to make sense of people's lives. So it's interesting, on the one hand, you've got, the Bezos, Musk, we're going to just move, to another planet. Optimistic in a way, sort of like not, but scenario out there. And then on the other hand, we have Holmgren literally imagining Mad Max under a Thunderdome here. Okay. I feel bad just thinking about it. We hope this doesn't happen. But one thing about studying all these different scenarios is you get maybe a stronger notion that any one of them could potentially happen, and that we are at a fairly precarious time probably in the development of human civilization. All right. So, but in my estimation, and I would be interested in hearing from all of you, and I really encourage you to go to this website because I've only given it just a little bit of attention to give you an idea of what's here. But I think the brown tech scenario is actually what we are in which we have that slow decline in, fossil fuels, which is sort of manifested by an increasing attempt to extract them in more expensive ways. The use of some biofuels in the mix, a little bit of increasing use of wind and solar and so on, just because of that. All right. And so that is combined with what seems like more severe or rapid climate change systems than we would hope for and like. And I say that just because of, what's happening, not so much the science. I don't really need science. I've lived long enough to see a definite noticeable change in the climate here in the United States, as well as in the news around the world. So I don't really need science to figure this out. Something is happening that, and you know what? I don't even care if it's all man-made or not. Because the fact is, something is happening that is not good for human beings or the ecosystem. We should probably do anything we can think of to try to like affect that for the better for us. So, but what I find like the most interesting thing about this is this notion that the political system is described as corporatist or fascist, as in a merger of state and corporate power. I think we have that. It's not classically, like what we would consider as fascist, but in the strict sense of the term corporatist, it kind of is. There is a merger of state and corporate power, and therefore, the goal is to continue kind of doing what we're doing in the way of favoring growth of a certain kind through corporate growth over other more sustainable types of growth or even conservation. And that seems to describe exactly what our political economy looks like at this point. And because the decline is in biofuel, or I should say fossil fuels, is kind of prolonged, it is giving the chance to do some adaptation, but the adaptation is slow as well. And meanwhile, the climate change is happening faster, and that's adding this element of chaos that could bring things down more quickly. I'll read this part here. He says, rapid onset of climate change tends to support centralized nationalist systems for several reasons. First, the consequences of chaotic weather, food supply problems, radical land use change, and abandonment of marginal land leads to demands for strong government action to protect people from high food and fuel costs, natural disasters, the consequences of strong action by other nations, and mass migration by displaced people. Rates of urbanization increase as climate change impacts, and withdrawal of government-supported services in more remote rural regions accelerates. We do have that. I mean, it's being perhaps moderated a bit now, but yes, like the attention to people in rural areas outside of the people who run the rather large farms that we have, who do receive a lot of government support, the attention to just rural populations in the United States anyway is definitely declining. And that has led to some of the political woes that we have in this country with our culture wars and our total political impasse and such. So there's other things here that are so interesting, but I don't want to take up too much of time on this because I want people to listen to it. If there's enough interest in it, then maybe I'll make another video going more into this brown text scenario, or even review Holmgren's book, which is associated with this website. So let me know what you think. Let me know if what scenario you think we're most likely to be in, and we'll see what happens.